That got us off to a perfect start. Thank you, Tim. Keep the comments coming, folks. One of the things that's really good about this format is how we get to see your reactions to the points being made in real time rather than surfing Twitter later, so keep it up. And we'll pick up on any particularly interesting points in the Q&A sessions as we go through today. Now, one of the things that excite me about facilities management in the modern era is the amount of insight that can be gained from the data available to us by people like Tim and by the work of our next speaker too. We've spent many years trying to meet the needs of our customers based on random conversations, a bit of guesswork, and the opinions of a few pundits. But now we can explore real trends based on solid data and create more informed forecasts about what's coming next. Here to give us her view, based on the work done by workplace consultants Wkspace, is their managing director and founder. Please welcome Hanna Nardini.
Thank you, Martin, for the introduction. And so, hello, I'm Hanna Nardini. I'm from Wkspace, and I'm the founder of a business that has three particular specialisms. It's independent workplace strategy, and that's with a strong emphasis on psychology. It's commercial interior design, and it's behavioural change management, which is very important when it comes to delivering maybe some of the strategy that we've recommended. As you can imagine, it's been incredibly busy over the past 15 months. I wanted to share with you some of the insights from our work during this time period. We've actually been embarking on global surveys on a weekly basis. That combined with some of our own client data, actually worked with 144 clients during this time, has resulted in well over 400,000 responses to some of our surveys. There are many questions and things around the purpose of the office. What's the role that it plays? How do we motivate people to go back? How do we consider well-being in all of these things? What happens with a hybrid workforce? What does flexible working look like in future? How do we create this inclusive experience, regardless of whether you are working remote or whether you're there in person? But we're also seeing sustainability finally come onto the radar, which is great to see. So the process that we embark upon, we've noted for the first time, has become a lot more multifaceted. We're starting with the overall visioning session that happens with the leadership team. It's the aspirations. What does that long-term picture look like? We move into much more wide-scale employee engagement, so the use of surveys. But we then have to take a step back. We can't just look at things from just a leadership perspective and just an employee perspective. Managers have a pretty good view of the collective that sits within their team. So we need to get a perception of what do they think, or how have things changed for them, or how might things change for their team. We then need to add into that new starters. What has their experience been? They may never have visited the office. They may not have met people in person. But have they integrated into the culture of that workplace in the way that you would expect? And then finally, we get to talk to some of our clients. What's their experience been working with this organisation over the past 15 months? But how do they see things changing for them and the relationship they've got with that client going forward? Will they return to in-person meetings maybe? But there are some trends that we've noted. The bandwagon effect is a little bit of a bias, and it's influencing to some extent the way people are thinking, very much closely linked with the media. So, for example, when Goldman Sachs came out and said, we want people to return back into the office, there was an immediate ripple effect that had with clients. And it started to perhaps create a little bit of conflict or reluctance to move forward and make some of those decisions in some instances. But nevertheless, when we push past those boundaries, we are seeing some organisations be much more proactive with their decision making. But we are seeing this emerge as longer term planning. So if we step back and just think about some of the trends of what we've noticed with our clients, remote working worked. It's actually surprised some people, some of those people who were maybe the skeptics before COVID on actually, I don't really think that people are that productive or effective working remote. They've come around full circle. So we see that overall performance has not been impacted in a negative way in the majority of instances. But we have noted that the cracks are starting to appear. We've also seen the differences between worker profiles start to get bigger, in particular around the generational groups, around the personalities that sit within the workplace, but even between the employer and the employee relationship. Working more hours and increased screen time, I think we can all relate to that, and it's particularly amplified in the past 2 months. We managed to fill our commute time with work, but we are seeing overall well-being starting to suffer. We're seeing stress levels increase. People have become frustrated. Patience is wearing thin, which means that some of the relationships that exist internally between teams are starting to become a little bit more fragile. But osmosis learning, that professional development, particularly amongst the younger of the generations, is lacking. Some of the younger generation are concerned, does this mean that there's going to be a challenge for them professionally in maybe 2 or 3 years' time? But what's also interesting from this, and part of our client engagement, is around the weakening of the relationships. So the feeling that existing client relationships switched across to virtual means pretty effectively. In fact, we report relationships have strengthened in a lot of instances. But it's those new client relationships when we know that a bond is built by being there in person. Some people defined it as seeing the whites of your eyes. The general view is loyalty is built when you build this element of social capital. So it's felt, and having engaged and asked this question many times, that 3 meetings is the most optimal amount of meetings that would happen face-to-face before you would feel comfortable and confident enough about moving that relationship more virtually. But when we ask people, and employees in particular, about their expectations on working remote in future, and do they see this as a part of their lives going forward, you'll start to see this pattern emerge. Now, this has been pretty static for quite some time now. Early on in the pandemic, we noticed that only working remote and having much more of a virtual lifestyle was around 30%. And it's gradually declined and declined over time. The novelty wore off. So there's only 5% of people roughly would say, actually, I can see myself moving out of the city, moving closer to family networks and being a full remote worker. The opposite end of that, though, we're seeing only 2% roughly of people say, no, I can see myself being in the office for 5 days a week. But the typical go-to is somewhere between 2 and 3 days in the office, combined with a little bit more flexible schedules, which might mean you're in a lot more in 1 week and less the week after. That means your occupation could sit about 39%. But when we compare that to a manager view, we start to notice maybe some differences appearing here. So yes, managers around the same 5% see their teams working only in a remote way. But you'll notice at the opposite end of that, we're seeing a lot more tendency towards managers wanting teams back in the workplace. The acknowledgement that good things happen when we come together. And that's likely to see occupation sitting at around 50%. So there are differences. And the questions that a lot of organizations are asking is, well, what do we do about this? Where do we draw that line as far as what we plan for in the next steps? But if we progress that a little bit further and start to think about, well, what are the reasons why people will want to come back into the office? This is a quote that came up in one of our surveys that's really resonated with us. Is just, what's the point? What is the point of doing that hour commute when you've just left your home office that had a perfectly good desk that you could sit at? So what we are starting to realize is the top 5 reasons why people are likely to attend the office are these. The first one is around socializing, coming out of that isolated feeling and just being around your colleagues, but also working collaboratively with them. For some people, it is just mixing it up. It's that change of routine and scenery. It's the return to some face-to-face client meetings, as we mentioned. Maybe it's those 3 for that new client relationship. We're seeing less tendency towards people say they'll come in just for internal meetings, acknowledging that actually virtual meetings are likely to be here to stay. But finally, just for that sense of community, just to reconnect with the organization, with the culture, with the values, with the vision, the mission of the workplace overall. To feel like you are valued and that you're an integral part of something, that you make a difference. Again, this is one of the things that we've noticed is starting to weaken, in particular, over the past few months. So when we start to think about what this immediate short term looks like, our clients are looking at the long term first. They need to understand what they're trying to achieve in the short term. Some of the trends that we've noticed and the conversations that we're having is built around space rationalization and reduction. That is typically the go-to. The figure seems to be sitting around 30%. It could be that there's multiple offices. Do we need that many offices? Could we actually look at consolidation exercises? But the converse of that could be, actually, we're growing. We've got 20 or 30% growth plans, but we don't want to take more real estate. So is it possible for us to be accommodated in this space and just work smarter? We are seeing the activity-based working methodology become more fast-tracked. People are moving there a lot quicker and adopting principles of it, but very much centered around understanding what that particular business needs. Conversations around stay versus go. Is this the right space? Do we need to be in a city? But finally, as a trend we've noted, is much more connected thinking. So a lot of our clients have national offices. They may have a lot of international offices. For the first time, we're seeing a more holistic view on real estate planning. Let's create the template. Let's test this in all of our offices and really understand what this future looks like for our organization. So I'm going to share with you now the top 5 things that I've noted coming through as far as these immediate next steps. Remote working frameworks. We're seeing it sometimes defined as more principle-based rather than policy-based. Freedom within a framework has become quite a popular term. But it's about identifying where the challenges are and what has worked, hasn't worked, where are the differences emerging between our worker profiles, and pulling it together. Creating some form of structure that sits behind this. What is expected of people? But we're seeing this done on a more universal scale. We're not seeing it at a team level of allowing individual teams to do their own type of thing. We're seeing companies look at this very much as a holistic overview. This is what we are trying to achieve, and this is what you are able to do. We are seeing those figures sit somewhere between 40 or 60%. We're seeing it more in percentage terms than we are in days, but using that as part of a trial. Does it work? Let's monitor, measure, and review on a regular basis. But manager coaching has become quite a consistent approach, making sure that it's fair. So if there are some managers, as we noted there, that may be expecting higher occupation in the office, making sure that they are adopting the spirit that sits behind this framework and being fair in how it's administered within the individual teams. The return to office plans. We have September, and people seem to feel that September is when things change or things open up. It's seen as kind of fresh beginnings. So we do see phase 1 potentially being much more of perhaps a wider scale opening of offices starting at this particular time period. But we're unsure of what social distancing might look like in the workplace. So there's a second phase to this, typically seen as next year. I think a lot of people acknowledge that maybe things won't settle into a true pattern until the new year. Whether that's January remains to be seen. But some conversations have been had about regular team days. So do we have certain days during the week when we would expect teams to come back together? We are noticing from an employee view a little bit of pushback if that is fixed too rigidly. It's not necessarily playing into that flexibility that a lot of people are demanding. But we're also having conversations with clients about layered modeling. What does the workplace look like if certain teams were to come in on certain days, making sure that you've got that right co-working and right co-location? But actually, if you were to look at workplace in that way, you could achieve significant space savings by rotating people through the space. Now, it works for some organizations and some sectors, not for others. So we're not saying or endorsing any particular methodology here. But this is typically the direction of travel that we're seeing. Behavior shifts. It's about cutting the plugs off printers. People have coped without it. In fact, we're noticing there is only 6% of people have reported that they've missed the printer. They've coped without the storage. Some reported that they took suitcases of filing home that they've not actually opened. People have been forced into using more digital systems. It's become more reliant. They need to work though. But we are seeing perhaps a trend towards paperless, paper light. Let's get rid. At least 70% is the go-to. Clear desk policies in light of keeping the environment COVID safe. Clear Desk is actually a pretty good strategy to start embracing. It can help you plan for the long term, particularly if you are going to be looking at shared models and activity-based working. Get people into that good habit and practice now. But we are seeing an emergence of behavioural contracts, that sense of personal responsibility. This isn't just a facilities team running around after people. It's individuals taking that responsibility themselves, not only for their own well-being, but also for their colleagues. But let's make inclusive narrative part of the day-to-day language. So how do we make people behave in an inclusive way? What are the ground rules? How are hybrid meetings going to operate in our particular organisation? Now, I'll be honest, there's a multiple different approaches to this. Organisations need to work out what's right for them, and it might vary by team to some extent. Workplace change. In some instances, we're seeing 2 to 3 years away from lease events. So it's not really the right time to start thinking about rationalisation or space reduction just yet. But people are keen to experiment. Let's use that time wisely. We've got this momentum, let's continue that going. So let's think about low-cost piloting where we reuse, repurpose and recycle. It would typically be segments of the office that get taken and reused. It's about changing the behaviours of how you operate in that space, maybe more than the space itself. But we're seeing things like trialing furniture. It's getting manufacturers to loan things. People are looking at secondhand. They're looking at rotating maybe products around the office and trying it in different positions to see how it works better. We are seeing desk sharing come through though. Could that work? Let's see how people feel about it. As part of our engagement, we find that when people have walked through the process, we end up with around 74% support for sharing space, particularly as people acknowledge they will be doing more remote working. We need to think about how virtual meetings will happen. So whilst, yes, they can happen in an open plan environment, they can't happen if everybody around you is also doing virtual meetings. But equally, the behaviours need to change, that we don't see 1 or 2 people jumping into a 6, 8 or 10 person meeting room. We're seeing the emergence of catering coming back into the offices more than ever. It's the deli bar, a cafe, coffee points, baristas starting to come in. Thinking about what makes the office a destination workplace. And finally, well-being focus. We're seeing things like Peloton bikes or spaces that can reconfigure and be used for yoga. Areas that are sort of more reflection areas, relaxation. It could be more winter garden type of principles, areas where people can manage stress levels. We're even seeing counselling rooms come in, a space where you can go in and talk to a counsellor immediately, but virtually. Parents' rooms, the focus on inclusive behaviours again in the workplace. And then finally on technology, it's around desk booking systems. It's moved forward. It's not just room booking. People want to know that they can plan ahead. They can book. They know there's a space that they can go to. There's a space that suits the task. We're seeing the emergence of lifestyle apps, planning your commute. When is the best time for you to set off to avoid the queues? How busy are the showers? Can you book your cycle spot? Even down to real-time data when you are in the office. How busy is the print area or the coffee point? Is now the time to go and get my lunch? Or am I going to be queuing for 20 minutes? We're seeing this technology integration in the workplace take center stage. It's about finding the right tools that enable the virtual connection and also the in-person connection to be seamless. Standardized setup, you can sit anywhere in the office, you can plug in and it just works. You are able to pull people in to those types of scenarios too. But we're also seeing IoT sensors and data capture. Let's gather as much data as we possibly can and use that as a mechanism for making informed decisions going forward. So if I had to give you 3 trends of what is going up and what is going down. Going up, without a doubt, is hybrid working models. It is about accepting remote working is here to stay, but maybe not full-time remote working. Activity-based working offices, people are piloting it. If not piloting it, they are just embracing it and going for it. It's de-risked projects. You know that you can do this. So we're seeing a lot more emphasis around what it means for each organisation. But more strategic planning, no longer are we looking at the next 2 to 3 years. We're now planning 10 to 15 years in some instances. That's some of the leases that are happening right now. But not just a bunch of the leadership team making a decision. It's built around informed decision making from wide scale engagement. Let's look at all of it in a very holistic way. What's going down? Sneeze screens and perspex, which we were glad to see never appeared in our clients' offices. But we are seeing less around full-time working in the office and full-time remote working. It's likely to have more of a balanced approach that sits in the middle. Interestingly, open plan. There's obviously been a long-term issue with some open plan working, but actually more in favour of collaboration spaces, project areas, team working, virtual meeting hubs, cafes, working in all of these different dynamic spaces rather than just anchoring down to a desk. And finally, the trend towards paperless, paper light, less storage. Let's not clog the office up with paper. Let's use it smarter. But let's also think sustainably too. So also built around less printing. So those are just some of the key trends that we wanted to share with you today. I appreciate some of you are in very different places on where you are with your own workplace transformation. Obviously, welcome coming back to questions later on in today's session. Thank you for listening.